and we also filter our actions according to these same values. So our sensory and motor functions are determined by those values. When we see somebody that we think supports our values, we tend to lift them up. We tend to be attracted to them. We open up to them. We may even become infatuated with them or compulsively addicted to them in some cases. When we do, we minimize ourselves relative to people we put on pedestals. When we do, we also tend to think, well, we need to be more like them. So we tend to sacrifice and minimize ourselves and try to change ourselves to be more like them and try to change ourselves into them. When we do, we are not grateful for ourselves. And we're basically minimizing ourselves, creating a persona and mask, and exaggerating them, projecting a mask. Then we go and do the opposite. We aggrandize ourselves relative to other people. We minimize them. We tend to project our values onto them and throw imperatives on them, like they should do this and ought to be doing that. And then what we do is we want to change them relative to us. And we want them to be going against their will. And anytime we try to change ourselves relative to others or try to change others relative to us, we are trying to go against human will and human value systems, which is futile. And so in the process of doing it, we're ungrateful. We don't see the order because we're desiring to change everything. And when we do, our heart closes. We have a bipolar state instead of an open-hearted state. We have conditions instead of unconditioned. In that, because of that conditional state of exaggeration and minimization of ourselves and others, and the polarities and positive and negative attachments we've given, we automatically have uncertainties. I like to think of it as quest ions, ions on a quest for neutralization. And when we do, we have uncertainty because the truth is we're reflections of these people. We're neither above or below them. We're just pure reflections, unique to our own values. When we actually have reflective consciousness and own those states, instead of exaggerate or minimize ourselves relative to them, we poise ourselves. We have nothing to change. We see the order, and our heart opens. Our love comes out, and that is the state where certainty comes because the ions are gone, and we have presence because we're not living in the past or future because of the anxieties of these illusions. That certainty and presence is what allows the power of our intention to manifest and create in a state of presence. Not over time, but now. And we then have certainty because I always say our human will matches our divine will there. And when we have humbleness to divinity, we have certainty for humanity. And that is where the power of creation comes. I think that's the most powerful state.
Indeed. It's a mastery of the moment in one sense. I am just struck by the ability that you have to articulate the perennial wisdom and the truth of consciousness in action. And so I'm going to remind our listeners right now that you can go back and click on the archive and scroll back and hear these words again. It's one of the beauties of Internet radio is you can repeat and repeat until you get it.
Well, what a good idea.
So thank you for that.
Spaced repetition.
Well, so often, again, I'm delighting in your story and the pearls that you're sharing with us. That, as we go through our lives, my experience is there is a yearning. There is something inside that's seeking to come into congruence, into a higher order expression. And when I hear your story about being told that you wouldn't amount to anything and then taking a kind of a recess from responsibility might be one way of looking at that. On another hand, perhaps giving yourself the Hawaiian recipe for maturation.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I had a responsibility to catch tubes.
There you go.
But at any rate, there was something that was seeking to emerge in your life.
Well, when I was hitchhiking from Houston, Texas to California, I ended up in El Paso, Texas. And they didn't have a freeway finished at the time. Interstate 10 wasn't completed. And I had to walk through the downtown area. As I was walking down through the downtown area, and I was sort of in an altered state anyway, I came across 3 cowboys. Now, a long-haired hippie surfer with a headband and 3 cowboys in those days didn't get along so well.
What's wrong with this picture?
Well, that's just great.
Yeah, so anyway, I come across these cowboys, and they lined up across the sidewalk, and they weren't going to let me pass. They didn't like a long-haired hippie guy. And I didn't know what to do. I couldn't outrun them because I had a surfboard. I couldn't go inside the shops because I was trapped. I couldn't, I didn't know what to do. And all of a sudden, an inner voice, a whisper, told me what to do. And believe it or not, an inner voice said to bark at them and growl at them. And it was the strangest thing. I'd start barking and growling, and these guys just moved aside and let me go by.
Let the crazy man through.
Let this guy must be on drugs. Well, I was. It was so funny. And so anyway, I walked up, and as I came past him and growled at him, there was a bum on the corner who saw it. and he was literally leaning over on the lamppost laughing so hard. He'd never seen anything so funnier because he saw this one little young 14-year-old kid, just outdoing these probably 19-year-old cowboys. Then he came up to me and he put his arm on my shoulder and he said, "Sonny, that's the funniest dang thing I ever seen." He says, "Can I buy you a cup of coffee?" I said, "No, sir, I don't drink coffee." "Can I buy you a Coke?" "Yes, sir." He took me to a malt shop. We had a Coke. He asked me if I was a runaway. I said, "No, my parents gave me a ride to the freeway." And then he said, "Are you through with your Coke?" I said, "Yeah." He took me to a library, literally walked me to a library. He said, "I have something I want to teach you." Took me to a library, up these steps into the library. I put my stuff outside where the information desk was. We walked in. He sat me down at a table. He went off into the bookshelves. He came back. He sat right next to me, and he said, "Son, there's two things I want to teach you, boy. The first one is to never judge a book by its cover, because it will fool you." He says, "I'll bet you think I'm a bum." And, of course, looking at him, he looked like one.
Yep.
And he said, "I'll bet you think I'm a bum, but let me tell you, son, I'm one of the wealthiest men in America and maybe the world. I have cars and ships and planes and homes and companies." He says, "But let me tell you, about a year ago, somebody very special in my life passed away, and I thought and reflected on my life and wondered, what would happen? I don't want to go through my life without knowing what it's like to have nothing, because I've been so blessed." So he said, "I decided to take at least a year of my life to travel in the streets with nothing, just to know what it's like." He says, don't ever judge a book by its cover." And then he took my right hand and he put it on top of two books that he brought back from the shelves, which happened to be Aristotle and Plato. He put my hand on there and he said, "Young man, you learn how to read, boy. You learn how to read." He said, "Because there's only two things they can never take away from you in your life, and that is your love and your wisdom. So you gain the wisdom of love and the love of wisdom. And don't you ever forget that, young man." And he put the books back on the shelves. He walked me back out over to where the highway was. And he said, "Don't ever forget those two things." Well, I was 14. I'm 52 now. So that's whatever many years that is. I've never missed that, never forgotten that. And I've dedicated my life to love and wisdom. And I hope nobody judges my book covers. But I can tell you, it turned out that gentleman was one of the wealthiest people in the world. And I found that out not but 5 years ago. So it is really interesting how this ended up being a true story. So, you never know who you could run into along the journey, hitchhiking from California to California from Texas.
Well, it's indeed true, and whether or not that gentleman was a wealthy individual in money, he was certainly wealthy in spirit and love to give you attention and wisdom in that way.
And aren't you glad you listened to the voice that said, "Start barking"?
Well, I tell you what, there's a book that's actually coming out of Australia and New Zealand called The Boy Who Barked.
I love it.
And it's a little book that somebody heard that story and taped it and transcribed it and asked if they could publish that little book. And lo and behold, there's going to be a book soon called The Boy Who Barked. It's about that story, because I guess that touched them.
Well,
but you never know where you're going to get great wisdom.
Well,
No.
Exactly, and that's what's so touching about that story is it's about trusting the inner, what we often call the dismissible voice, that when we start allowing ourselves to really pay attention to the wisdom and the gifts that are working through us, then we all open ourselves up to an enormous amount of beautiful receiving energy.
Well, it was Albert Einstein. When I turned, after I left Hawaii and I came back to Texas, I took a GED, a high school equivalency test, and I passed. All I was doing is saying I'm a genius and I apply my wisdom. And I just filled in some dots and I guessed and I passed. Then I took a college entrance exam and somehow I passed that. And then I took my first college test and I failed it. I got a 27. And I was really defeated and I really didn't, my whole program came up. And I went home crying. I had to pull off on the side of the road driving home, crying so much. I came back and I just curled up in the fetal position in the living room, and my mom said, "God, what's happened? What happened?"